The fluorescent lights inside Marigold Diner buzzed overhead like a nest of angry wasps, casting a cold, sterile glow over the faded, checkered linoleum floor. It was 9:47 p.m. Outside, the world had already slipped into silence, but inside the diner, Carlos Alvarez stood at the edge of the service counter, adjusting his black tie for the third time in 10 minutes. It had become a nervous habit, one he couldn't seem to break, ever since that night. 6 months had passed, but the memory clung to him like a shadow stitched to his heels. Back then, this job hadn't meant much. $12 an hour, plus tips that barely covered groceries, let alone rent. He had never imagined himself caring this much about such a low-pay gig. But after the mistake that nearly cost him everything, every shift now felt like a tightrope walk. Every night, he clocked in exactly 13 minutes early, not because it earned him anything, but because it was his way of reclaiming control, however small, over a life that felt like it was constantly slipping through his fingers. "You're early again," Sandra's voice floated over from the counter, gravelly and weary like someone who'd spent the past 20 years pouring coffee for people chasing dreams they never caught. She tied her apron behind her back with the casual precision of someone who didn't need to think about the motion anymore. "You know Frankie doesn't pay you for those extra minutes, right?" Carlos offered her a tired smile, the kind that doesn't quite reach the eyes. "I know. I just like to be ready." Ready for what? Even he wasn't sure. Maybe ready to redeem himself. Maybe ready for the moment everything would finally fall apart for good. That mistake 6 months ago had seemed so minor at the time. A $47.00 refund. An elderly woman had claimed she'd been double-charged for her meal, and Carlos, trying to do the right thing, had attempted to fix the error. But the register was old and clunky, and one wrong tap had made the money vanish without a trace. It took the managers 3 weeks to notice, and when they did, it was like the sky fell in. Carlos had been summoned to the back office, where Frankie, the assistant manager with too much ego and not enough grace, looked at him like a criminal. Frankie's breath reeked of cheap energy drinks and something colder. Resentment. "One more screw-up, Alvarez," he'd said, each word a nail hammered into the coffin of Carlos's future. "I don't care if you discover a cure for cancer during your shift. If you mess up again, you're out." Since then, Carlos had become the model employee, silent, efficient, invisible. He came in early, stayed late, didn't make waves. He'd learned to swallow his pride when customers insulted him, learned to nod along when Frankie made those passive-aggressive comments, and learned to keep his mouth shut when he was consistently assigned to the graveyard shift. An unspoken punishment dressed up as opportunity. "More tips," Frankie had once told him, with a smile that had no business being called a smile. What Frankie hadn't said was that the night shift at Marigold was where hope came to die. It was the hour of long-haul truckers hunting caffeine, insomniacs clinging to lukewarm coffee like it was the last thing tethering them to the earth, and lonely drunks just looking for somewhere warm to forget. But over the past 3 weeks, something had changed. Every night at exactly 10:15, Carlos found himself looking toward the front door. And like clockwork, she would appear, this girl who couldn't have been more than 16 or 17. Her dark hair was pulled into a messy ponytail, her jacket threadbare and a size too big. She carried a backpack that looked like it held her entire life. Clinging tightly to her hand was a little boy, no older than 7, who followed her with the kind of trust only children possess when the world has given them no one else. Carlos didn't know their last names. They had never offered, and he never asked. The first night they came in, he thought they were waiting for someone. Maya had chosen the corner booth, the one with the ripped vinyl seat that management had been promising to fix for 2 years, and had sat there quietly, ordering only water. Eli, the little boy, got restless, but Maya would hush him gently. her eyes flitting to the counter, as if she feared someone might ask them to leave. But Carlos never saw them as a problem. If anything, they were a strange kind of comfort. He couldn't explain it, but there was something in Maya's eyes that mirrored his own. The same quiet desperation, the same fragile strength, the same aching hope that somehow, if they just kept moving forward, things might not fall apart. That night, like so many nights since, Carlos felt a faint, inexplicable tightness in his chest when the door opened and the familiar pair stepped in. It was nearing midnight when Carlos finally approached their table. Maya looked up, and Carlos saw too much in her eyes. Things a teenage girl shouldn't have to carry. The burden of responsibility, the weight of fear, and something far older than her years. "We're fine," she said. Her voice was calm, but her hands trembled as they clutched her brother's. She was holding it together by sheer force of will. Eli was busy drawing on napkins with a broken crayon, brow furrowed in intense concentration. Carlos leaned in and saw what the boy had been sketching. The diner. Every detail. The counter, the stools, even the old coffee machine humming in the corner. But Eli's version was different. In his world, every table had a vase of fresh flowers. Sunlight streamed through the windows onto golden fields, not the cracked asphalt of the truck stop outside. "He's an artist," Maya said softly, following Carlos's gaze. "Aren't you, Eli?" The boy nodded solemnly, then returned to his drawing like it was a task of utmost importance. Carlos walked away, but something kept pulling his gaze back to them. Maya kept checking her phone, and Eli kept drawing, but the longer they stayed, the more obvious it became. The person they were waiting for wasn't coming. At nearly 2 a.m., as Carlos began closing up, he made a decision. He approached their booth with a plate in hand, a grilled cheese sandwich cut diagonally the way his mother used to make it. Beside it, a bowl of steaming tomato soup. On the house," he murmured, setting it gently in front of Eli. The boy's eyes went wide with surprise and hunger. Maya started to protest, but Carlos lifted a hand. "It's fine, sometimes we make too much. It would just go to waste." That was a lie. The soup had been his dinner, the sandwich something he'd quietly paid for out of his own pocket. But the look of relief on Maya's face, and the careful, reverent way Eli began to eat, like the food might disappear if he moved too fast, made it more than worth it. In that moment, Carlos understood something that couldn't be written in any policy manual. Some things matter more than rules, more than money, more than self-preservation. Some things, like giving a hungry child a warm meal, were simply the right thing to do. From that night forward, a quiet ritual began to take shape. Every evening, at precisely 10:15 p.m., Maya and Eli would walk through the diner's heavy glass door and head straight to the same corner booth. It wasn't officially reserved, but everyone had come to understand that it belonged to them. And Carlos, without a word, without ever asking, would serve them the same meal: a grilled cheese sandwich sliced diagonally and a bowl of steaming tomato soup. No one requested it, no one thanked him out loud, but the understanding was there. Unspoken, but deeply felt. A kind of silent covenant made of trust, compassion, and dignity. But tonight something felt wrong. Carlos glanced over at their booth and felt a sharp pang in his chest. Eli didn't look like himself. The dark circles under his eyes had deepened since the night before. His usual curious energy had faded, and though the grilled cheese sat in front of him like always, his movements were sluggish. Each bite seemed forced, as if chewing required more effort than his small body could spare. "Everything okay?" Carlos asked softly, as he refilled Maya's water glass. Her response came too quickly, too rehearsed. "We're fine, we're totally fine." But Carlos had grown up in a house where fine was a code word for everything falling apart. He recognized the tension in her shoulders, the clipped pitch in her voice, the way she avoided eye contact. He knew what it meant to pretend you were okay, just to keep breathing. Eli, the same boy who once filled napkins with drawings of bright sunlight and blooming flowers, was now fading before his eyes. And Maya was doing her best to carry the weight of a collapsing world on shoulders far too young. Carlos returned to the counter, but his thoughts stayed locked on that corner booth. He checked his bank account. $127.00. Rent was due in 5 days. Each meal he provided cost the diner around $3.50, but to avoid drawing suspicion, Carlos had been ringing them up as $6.00 and paying out of pocket. $18 a week, $72 a month. It wasn't much to most people, but to Carlos, it was everything. He wiped down the counter again, the 4th time that night, and caught sight of his reflection in the chrome of the coffee machine. 26 years old, but the worry lines on his face told another story. His eyes held more than exhaustion. They carried the weight of decisions that couldn't be undone. His father had once told him, "A man isn't measured by what he owns, but by what he's willing to give up for others." Back then, Carlos hadn't understood what that meant. Now, he did. At exactly 11:30, Maya and Eli stood to leave. Eli moved slowly, his tiny body weighed down by something more than fatigue. Maya placed a gentle hand on his back to steady him. As they passed the counter, Eli looked up at Carlos and smiled. A real, sincere, innocent smile that made the entire diner seem to breathe easier for a moment. "Thank you," Maya whispered, so softly it was almost lost beneath the hum of the overhead lights. After they left, Carlos stood alone in the empty diner, bathed in the flickering glow of fluorescent bulbs. He knew he'd do it all again tomorrow, and the next day, and the next, even if it meant losing what little he had left. Because loyalty wasn't always about rules or paychecks. Sometimes, loyalty meant being the one who showed up when no one else would. And Carlos Alvarez, after everything he'd endured and everything that might still be coming, had nothing left but loyalty. 3 nights earlier, a man had quietly appeared during the overnight shift, like a shadow slipping in through the edge of Carlos's vision as he was refilling the sugar dispensers. 1 minute, the back hallway had been empty. The next, there he was, a man in gray janitorial coveralls, pushing a cart filled with cleaning supplies. "Name's Wayne," he'd told Sandra during the shift change. His voice was gravelly, like the rumble of tires on old concrete. "I'll be handling nights." That was the most Carlos had heard him say in 3 days. Carlos had taken to calling him Mr. Wayne, out of a mixture of respect and curiosity. He was different from the previous janitors. Older, maybe in his 50s, with graying hair and work-worn hands that looked like they'd done more than mop floors. There was something deliberate about the way he moved. Slow, precise, like he was observing, taking mental notes. Not just cleaning, but studying. Most night shift janitors were college students earning extra cash, or retirees trying to make ends meet. They came and went quickly, never really seeing the place they worked in. But Mr. Wayne saw things. On Thursday night, Carlos noticed something peculiar. Maya and Eli had just left. Eli had barely touched his soup, a fact that worried Carlos more than he cared to admit. Mr. Wayne was nearby, mopping the floors, but not in the usual quick back-and-forth pattern. He moved in slow, thoughtful circles, and every few seconds, his eyes would drift toward the corner booth. When Maya took Eli to the restroom, Carlos noticed Mr. Wayne pause beside their table. He wasn't cleaning. He wasn't wiping anything down. He just stood there, looking at the napkins Eli always left behind. those tiny drawings of other worlds. There was something unreadable in Mr. Wayne's expression, but then gently he reached down and folded the napkins. Not crumpling them, not tossing them away, he placed them carefully in his cleaning cart, like they were pages from a story too sacred to throw out. "He's kinda strange, that one," Sandra muttered during her break. "Frankie hired him through some temp agency, I think. Word is, they're paying him more than the last guy." She paused, then added with a shrug, "Makes you wonder what his story is." Carlos didn't have to wonder. In his experience, anyone working the graveyard shift at a place like Marigold Diner had a story, a past, a reason they preferred the quiet darkness of night to the chaos of daylight. But most of all, they had something they were running from or toward. Carlos respected that, because in a world where privacy was a luxury few people like them could afford, sometimes the deepest act of kindness was to leave someone's silence untouched. Still, Mr. Wayne's presence was becoming impossible to ignore. Friday night, while Carlos was wiping down the counter, he noticed that Mr. Wayne had cleaned the same section of floor 3 times, not because it was dirty, because he was watching. When Maya and Eli arrived at their usual time, Mr. Wayne positioned himself near the coffee station, close enough to observe, far enough to pretend it was coincidence. Carlos felt anxiety coil in his stomach like a knot. Was Mr. Wayne reporting back to management? Had Frankie sent someone to spy on him? The thought made Carlos's hands tremble as he prepared Eli's grilled cheese. But then something completely unexpected happened. As Carlos carried the meal toward their booth, his tired legs faltered. Just a small stumble, but enough to tilt the bowl of soup dangerously. He could already see it playing out, the mess, the reprimand, Frankie using it as the final excuse to fire him. But then Mr. Wayne was there. Like a ghost stepping into the light, he appeared at Carlos's side and steadied his arm with surprising gentleness. "Careful there," he said, his voice low and even, his eyes locking briefly with Carlos's. There was no accusation in them, no judgment, just understanding. "Thank you," Carlos whispered, and meant it, more than Mr. Wayne could ever know. Mr. Wayne gave a small nod and walked away, returning to his cleaning like nothing had happened. But Mr. Wayne appeared beside him like a shadow unfolding from the dim light. He reached out, steadying Carlos and the tray with surprising gentleness. "Careful," he said quietly, his gaze meeting Carlos. There was no accusation in those eyes, no suspicion, just understanding. Silent, steady, and deeply human. "Thank you," Carlos whispered, and he meant it more than he'd meant almost anything in his life. Mr. Wayne gave a small, respectful nod and returned to his cleaning without another word, as if the moment had never happened. By Saturday night, the strange relationship between the two men had quietly shifted into something new. Carlos was cleaning up after what he jokingly called the rush, really just a few long-haul truckers and exhausted night shift regulars. He glanced over and noticed Mr. Wayne sitting at the counter, staring into a mug of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. There was a heaviness to him, not the fatigue of aching joints or a long shift, but the weight of time itself. The kind of exhaustion that settled into a person's bones when life had asked more of them than it ever should have. Without thinking too hard, Carlos sliced the last piece of apple pie from the day's batch, a piece destined for the trash, and slid it onto a plate beside the mug. "Tough night?" he asked gently. Mr. Wayne looked up, mildly surprised, and in that fleeting second something shifted. The mask of quiet indifference cracked and Carlos saw something beneath it. Grief, maybe. Or regret, or loss, so old and so deep that it had stopped bleeding and simply ached. "Sometimes the hardest part of the job," Mr. Wayne said softly, his voice like wind through old brick, "isn't what you have to do. It's what you have to watch and can't change. Carlos nodded. He understood. Too well. He was about to walk away when Mr. Wayne continued, his eyes still fixed on the untouched coffee. The two kids, the girl and her brother, you've been kind to them. Carlos's blood turned to ice. Here it was, the moment he'd been dreading, the line he feared he'd crossed without realizing. He swallowed hard and tried to keep his voice steady. I don't know what you're talking about. Mr. Wayne didn't respond immediately. He picked up his fork and cut a small corner from the pie, as if weighing the truth alongside the taste. In 30 years of doing this, he said slowly, I've learned that kindness, true kindness, is rare in places like this. People get too busy protecting themselves to notice when someone else is drowning. Finally, he turned and looked directly at Carlos, and in that quiet stare was something wordless, a silent, profound kind of recognition, the kind people share when they've walked through the same fire. But sometimes, someone throws a life ring, Mr. Wayne said, even when they're barely keeping their own head above water. Carlos didn't know what to say. His mouth moved, searching for a sentence that wouldn't betray how shaken he was. He mumbled something about needing to check the espresso machine and backed away behind the counter, heart pounding in his chest. When he finally turned around again, Mr. Wayne was gone. Only an empty plate remained on the counter, with loose change placed neatly beside it. But there was one more thing. Something under the coffee mug. A folded napkin, flattened, smoothed with care. It was one of Eli's drawings. On the back, written in neat, adult handwriting, were just 2 words. Don't stop. Monday morning. Carlos had just clocked out after another sleepless night shift, the buzz of fluorescent lights still echoing in his bones, when Frankie appeared in the break room doorway like a bad omen. His tie was crooked, his eyes sharp, and his smile cut like glass. Alvarez, office, now. Carlos felt the floor give way beneath him. He'd been bracing for this moment for weeks. He didn't know when it would come, only that it would. He followed Frankie down the narrow hallway that led to the manager's office, its walls stained with the smell of burnt coffee and broken second chances. Frankie closed the door slowly, deliberately, like a judge preparing to hand down a sentence. The desk was covered in printouts, a calculator, and a thick manila folder Carlos recognized instantly. His employee file. Sit, Frankie said, not bothering to look up. Carlos obeyed, perching on the edge of a rigid plastic chair, hands clenched tight until his knuckles turned pale. Through the thin walls he could still hear the sounds of the morning shift beginning. Coffee brewing, casual chatter, like they belonged to a world he no longer had access to. I've been going over some things, Frankie began, his voice falsely light, the tone of a man who already knew the outcome, reconciling receipts, checking inventory, making sure everything lines up. He spread the receipts across the desk like cards in a high-stakes poker game. Carlos recognized them immediately. 3 weeks' worth of transactions. Every night Maya and Eli had been there. Numbers don't lie, Alvarez, Frankie said, leaning back in his chair with a creak. People can lie, but not numbers. Carlos stayed quiet. Any excuse he offered now would sound exactly like what it was, a defense too late. I'm a reasonable man, Frankie continued, his voice now adopting a condescending lilt that made Carlos's stomach turn. Could be a glitch, a simple mistake. But 3 weeks in a row? He paused for effect, leaned forward. No, that's not a mistake. That's behavior. He flipped open the folder, revealing Carlos's old hiring photo. Carlos barely recognized the man in the picture. Eyes bright, smile hesitant but hopeful. A man who still believed that hard work and honesty were enough. Let's revisit your history, shall we? Frankie said, as if he were narrating someone's slow-motion downfall. 6 months ago, a $47.00 discrepancy. Took 3 weeks to catch, and now, missing inventory, undocumented food orders. He tapped the receipts with theatrical precision. Don't even bother blaming someone else. I checked the schedule. You were the only one on shift. The room began to feel smaller, closing in on Carlos like invisible walls were pressing in from every direction. His heartbeat pounded against his ribs, and his throat felt like sandpaper. I can explain, he started, voice low and strained, but Frankie lifted a hand to silence him. Everyone's got an explanation, Frankie said coolly, but explanations don't reconcile the books. They don't reassure corporate. You've got 48 hours to fix it. Get the numbers right, or else. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. They both knew what came next. Carlos stepped out of the office like a drowning man breaking the surface, gasping for breath but still sinking. The morning light outside was too bright, stabbing at his eyes like punishment. The parking lot stretched out before him, wide and barren like a desert he didn't have the strength to cross. He sat inside his old Honda for 20 minutes, staring blankly at the steering wheel, trying to solve an equation that had no solution. He couldn't ask Maya and Eli not to come back. They hadn't done anything wrong. He doubted they had anywhere else to go. But he also couldn't tell Frankie the truth. It would put them in danger. And he couldn't keep paying for their meals out of pocket, not when his job was already hanging by a single fraying thread. That night, Maya arrived at the diner looking more exhausted than he had ever seen her. Eli leaned into her side, too weak to stand on his own. Carlos brought over their usual meal, grilled cheese cut diagonally, tomato soup just hot enough to comfort. Eli didn't even look up from the napkin he was sketching on. "Maya," Carlos said gently, sitting down across from them. "I need to talk to you." Her head shot up, alarm flickering through her eyes like a fire she couldn't stamp out fast enough. "Did we do something wrong?" No, nothing like that." Carlos glanced around, making sure no one was within earshot. "But I'm in trouble. At work." He hesitated, then said it. "It's the meals. My manager, he found out." Maya's face went pale. She stood quickly, pulling Eli up by the hand. "We'll go. We won't come back." "I'm sorry. We never meant—" "Wait." Carlos cut her off softly, raising a hand, not to stop her physically but to steady the moment, to meet her fear with sincerity. "Please, just sit for one more minute." She froze, torn between instinct and trust. Slowly, reluctantly, she sat back down, her entire body coiled like a wire stretched to its limit. Carlos looked at them, the trembling young girl trying to be everything at once, and the boy who could barely lift his head anymore. "I need you to understand this isn't your fault," he said, watching Eli's head slump against the table. "It's not your fault, and it's not Eli's. But is there anyone else? Anyone who can help you? Family, a friend, a shelter, anything?" Maya gave a bitter laugh, dry and cracked like wind across a dead field. "If there was, do you think we'd be here every night?" That answer hit Carlos like a punch to the ribs, not just because of what she said, but because of how she said it. Calm, matter of fact, like she'd stopped hoping for rescue a long time ago. These two kids weren't just alone. They were adrift in a world that had long since turned its back on them. And Carlos, just a tired night shift waiter, had somehow become the last line between them and complete despair. "There's something else," Maya said after a moment, her voice shaking now. "Eli's getting worse. Yesterday he threw up twice, couldn't keep anything down. I think he needs to see a doctor." Carlos' eyes turned back to the boy. His skin was pale, lips tinged with blue, breath shallow and thin. A fog of dread rolled through Carlos' chest. "Maya," he asked gently, "what exactly is wrong with him?" She hesitated for a long time. Her eyes were red, filled with tears she refused to let fall. "I don't know. The social worker said maybe it's stress, after what happened with our parents. But now, it's worse. Way worse." She looked down, voice cracking. "I can't take him to the hospital. They'll ask questions. They'll separate us." And in that moment, Carlos finally understood. Maya wasn't just a sister. She was everything. Guardian, home, protector, love. And she was terrified. Not of sickness, but of what came after help arrived. Of a system that might mean well, but didn't always understand what it was taking from the people it tried to save. If she reached out for help, the cost might be losing the only person she had left. As they stood to leave, Eli stumbled. Carlos lunged forward and caught him before he could fall. The boy looked up at him, eyes impossibly young, but ancient in their sadness. "Thank you," Eli whispered, his voice no louder than a breath. When they were gone, Carlos sat at the counter alone, numb. Before him lay another one of Eli's napkin sketches, but it was different this time. No flowers, no sunshine, just a tiny figure standing alone in the rain, staring up at a distant, flickering star. Carlos folded the drawing with care, as if it were sacred, and tucked it into his wallet next to the last $43.00 he had before payday. 48 hours. To fix something that couldn't be fixed. To choose between saving himself or saving them. But Carlos had known his answer for a while now. He just hadn't let himself say it aloud. The next day passed like a dream soaked in exhaustion. Carlos wandered the grocery store twice, calculating, recalculating. He weighed each item like it carried the weight of an entire future. In the end, he bought $40.00 worth of food vouchers, scraped together from his coat pockets, an emergency jar of coins in the back of his kitchen drawer, and whatever was left in his account. That was supposed to be rent money. But how could rent matter more than making sure 2 kids didn't go to bed hungry? That night, when Maya and Ailey arrived, Carlos slipped the envelope across the table, trying to smile like it was part of some clever plan he'd just come up with. "You can use this at the store on Main," he said softly. "Good food, everything you need." Maya looked at the vouchers like they were printed in a foreign language. Eli sagged against her shoulder, barely conscious. "I can't take this," Maya murmured. "Maya, please. It's just like the meals here." "No, it's not." Her voice cracked in a way that broke something inside Carlos. "Really can't eat regular food anymore. He throws everything up, except the soup here, the grilled cheese, the way you make it. Soft, warm, gentle, it stays down." Carlos looked at the boy again, his skin pale as porcelain, eyes sunken, limbs limp. Even lifting his head seemed to drain what little energy he had left. "Needs a doctor," Carlos said. "I know." Maya's voice was sharp, almost angry, but then immediately softened with fear. "You think I don't know that? But if I take him in, they'll call child services. They'll ask where we live, who's caring for us, why we're not in school. And then they'll split us up. I've seen it happen. Foster care, shelters, siblings torn apart across counties." She shook her head, eyes shining. "Eli won't survive that, and neither will I." Carlos wanted to argue, wanted to say the system could help, but he had lived long enough to know, sometimes, the system didn't protect the ones who needed it most. He quietly slid the vouchers back into his apron, defeated. That night, the hours felt like a countdown to something inevitable. Every glance at the clock stole another second of safety. Every look at Eli made Carlos feel like time was running out. At 2 a.m., the breaking point came. Eli stumbled toward the restroom, and Maya rushed after him. From behind the thin bathroom wall, Carlos heard violent retching, a soft voice trying to soothe it, breaking under the weight of desperation. When they came back out, Eli looked like a ghost. Maya's eyes were red and puffy, but her face was calm in the way only people who had no more tears left could be. Carlos moved instinctively, grabbing a mop and cleaning supplies, but when he reached the hallway, Mr. Wayne was already there, mopping quietly, methodically, as if nothing could shake his rhythm. "That me," Carlos said. "It's all right," Mr. Wayne replied, his voice calm. "Kids, they get sick sometimes." They worked side by side in silence, but the silence wasn't heavy. It felt like something shared, understood, forgiven. When they finished, Mr. Wayne paused at the hallway's end, his eyes on Maya as she helped Eli into his coat. "The boy needs care," he said gently. "I know," Carlos whispered, "but I don't know how to help them anymore." Mr. Wayne didn't answer, but the look he gave Carlos, full of gravity, of sorrow, of something close to resolve, said he just might. "Sometimes," Mr. Wayne said quietly, "loving someone doesn't mean you can save them. It just means accepting that you can't save them alone." After Maya and Ellie had gone, Carlos sat alone in the break room, staring at the sheet of paper in his hands, the resignation letter he'd written during his last break. "Management, I hereby resign from my position as server at Marigold Diner, effective immediately. Thank you for the opportunity to work here. Sincerely, Carlos Alvarez." Just 3 sentences, but they read like a final door slamming shut on everything he had tried so desperately to hold together. Quitting meant no paycheck meant no rent, and no rent meant he'd be joining Maya and Eli, adrift, homeless, without an anchor. But sitting there, beneath the harsh buzz of the fluorescent lights, Carlos finally understood something. Some things mattered more than surviving. Some choices, no matter how costly, were worth making simply because they were right. He folded the letter carefully and placed it back inside his locker, but he didn't lock the door. Tomorrow, if Frankie demanded answers, Carlos would hand him that letter and walk away, with nothing left but his dignity, and maybe that would be enough. Before leaving the diner, Carlos made one last stop, a 24-hour pharmacy 3 blocks away. He swiped his debit card for a bottle of children's fever reducer and a few packets of electrolytes. Total $23.47. It was almost everything he had left to survive the week. But he bought it anyway. The following night, when Maya and Eli walked through the door, Carlos handed over the familiar meal in a small brown paper bag. "For the fever," he said simply. Maya's eyes welled up immediately, her lips parted, trembling. "Carlos, you didn't have to—" "Yes," he interrupted gently, "I did." And as he returned to the counter, something inside him settled. Not joy, not security, but peace. A rare, fragile peace that only comes when you know, without a doubt, that you've done the right thing, even if it costs you everything. Eli looked more alert tonight, blinking slowly, still pale, still fragile, but present. Maya sat beside him, reading the medicine label like it contained the key to their future, and maybe in some small way it did. Carlos had less than 24 hours left to fix the unfixable. He had chosen to spend it saving a child instead of himself. And for the first time that felt exactly right. The next night arrived like a storm he'd seen building on the horizon for days. Carlos clocked in at exactly 10 p.m., his resignation letter folded neatly in his back pocket, ready to hand over the moment Frankie showed up with accusations and ultimatums. But Frankie never came. Carlos worked the entire shift, inside a strange kind of calm, like the eye of a hurricane, where time slowed and the air was thick with a stillness that hinted at something more. Maya and Ely arrived at their usual time. Ely looked just a little better, a flicker of color returning to his cheeks after a day of medicine and rest. Still delicate, still breakable, but breathing easier. Carlos served their meal. Maya whispered a soft thank you, and he responded with a nod before going back to his duties. No drama, no fear, just quiet resolve. By 6 a.m., as the first light of dawn crept through the greasy windows, Carlos was wiping down the final table when he noticed something unusual. Mr. Wayne was still there. The older man sat quietly at the counter, 2 steaming mugs of coffee in front of him. His gaze met Carlos's, not accusing, not interrogating, just still, as though he'd been waiting for this moment. "Sit with me," Mr. Wayne said, motioning to the empty stool beside him. Carlos hesitated. Technically, there was no rule against chatting with a coworker, but given how close he was to the edge, every action felt like stepping on thin ice. "It's all right," Mr. Wayne added, as if he could read Carlos's thoughts. "Trust me." Something in his tone, calm, steady, assured, made Carlos let go of the rag and slide into the seat. They sat in silence, the comfortable kind, watching the sun wash gold across the empty parking lot. No need for words, no performance, just breath and stillness. Then finally Mr. Wayne spoke. "I built my first restaurant when I was 28, he said, his voice dipped in memory. Nothing fancy, just a little corner place where people could sit down, eat a warm meal, and feel like they mattered. Carlos listened, unsure where this was going. "I used to believe business wasn't just about profit," he continued. "It was about community, about taking care of people." Carlos nodded. He'd believed that once too. 30 years later, I owned 47 restaurants across 6 states. DuPont Hospitality Group. You've probably heard of it. Carlos blinked. The coffee cup nearly slipped from his hands. DuPont's Hospitality Group, the parent company that owned every Marigold diner. "Yes," Mr. Wayne, or rather Harold DuPont, continued, unfazed by the revelation he had just dropped. "Success has a way of changing people. Somewhere along the line, I stopped being the guy who cooked meals for neighbors and became the guy who read quarterly reports and worried about liability insurance." Carlos couldn't believe it. The founder of the company had been scrubbing floors beside him, quietly watching, for a week. 6 months ago, Harold said, his voice quieting, "We got sued. One of our employees claimed she was fired for speaking up about unsafe work conditions. She said we created an environment where good people were too afraid to do the right thing because they knew it might cost them their job." Carlos felt every word settle in his chest like a stone. "And she was right," Harold admitted. "I created a system where people like you, kind, decent people, have to risk everything just to feed 2 kids. And people like Frankie? They treat compassion like it's a liability." Carlos finally found his voice. "You've been watching me this whole time. You saw what I did." "I did? And you're going to fire me?" Harold looked at him then, really looked at him, and to Carlos' surprise his eyes were red with emotion. "No, Carlos, I'm going to thank you." Before Carlos could respond, Harold stood and walked toward the back office. The door opened, and out came Frankie, his signature smirk instantly vanishing when he saw who was waiting. "Master Dupont," Frankie stammered, going pale. I didn't realize—" "Sit down, Frankie," Harold said. His voice was soft, but it echoed with the kind of authority that silenced entire rooms. What followed was the most uncomfortable 10 minutes Carlos had ever witnessed. Harold questioned every decision Frankie had made over the past 6 months. The punitive shift schedules, the threats, the culture of fear, and when he brought up the vis discrepancies, Frankie crumbled. "I was just following protocol," Frankie sputtered. "Company policy clearly states—" "Company policy," Harold interrupted, "also clearly states that managers have access to a community support fund, a fund you've been pocketing for personal use." Carlos watched as Frankie turned from pale to a sickly shade of gray. And more than anything, Harold concluded, his voice calm but firm, threatening an employee for showing compassion isn't just against policy. It betrays the very ideals this company was founded on. Harold fired Frankie on the spot. The man who had once strutted through the diner with arrogant authority now shuffled out like a wounded animal, defeated, exposed, irrelevant. Harold returned to the counter, sitting beside Carlos, who was still. "I came here to remember why I started this company in the first place," Harold said gently. "And I found my answer the night I saw you take care of Maya and Eli. You reminded me that sometimes the most important thing a business can do is simply care about people." He pulled out a folded piece of paper. Carlos immediately recognized it, his resignation letter. "I found this in your locker," Harold said as he tore it clean in half. "But I've got a better idea." He handed Carlos a new document, freshly printed, with his name at the top. Night shift supervisor, fixed salary, full health coverage, and the freedom to help families who need it, no permission required. Carlos blinked. He had to read it twice just to believe it was real. "And most of all," Harold added with a warm smile, "I want you to remind me, every single day, what this work is really supposed to be about." Carlos, for the first time in 6 long months, smiled. A real one that reached his eyes. "I accept," he said. 2 weeks later, Marigold Diner looked almost exactly the same. The same buzzing fluorescent lights, the same scuffed linoleum floor, the same old coffee machine that wheezed like it was crying out for retirement. But something had shifted. Oh. Carlos glanced at the new nameplate on his chest. Carlos Alvarez, night shift supervisor. It still felt surreal, but it felt right. He had moved into a modest studio apartment 3 blocks from the diner, close enough to walk, far enough to feel like a new beginning. The steady paycheck meant he no longer had to ration sleep over every dollar. But the real change? It wasn't in his bank account. It was in the corner booth where Maya and Eli now ate without fear, without guilt, without hiding. Maya had softened. Her shoulders no longer bore the invisible weight of the world. She spoke about school now, about books she wanted to read, about dreams that had finally found room to grow. And Eli, the boy, was glowing. No more dark circles. His lips had turned pink again, his drawings full of sunshine, trees, and more recently, family. Last night he gave Carlos a picture. Marigold Diner, filled with smiling faces. Underneath, in neat, careful handwriting, were the words, "Not all heroes wear capes. Some wear aprons." The Kind Meal program, the very one Carlos now managed, was launched with quiet grace. No complicated forms, no red tape, just a simple mission: feed those who need to be fed. The first 3 families were already regulars. A single mother, a veteran living out of his car, a teenage girl with an infant, and nowhere else to go. The solution was always the same: dignity, compassion, and a warm meal without judgment. Harold partnered with a local community clinic. Dr. Sarah Chin came by twice a week to offer free medical checkups. Her first patient, Eli. After a few weeks of treatment, he was healthier than he had been in years. "I used to think success was about growth," Harold said one evening, sipping coffee beside Carlos at the counter. "Expansion. Market share." He paused, watching Maya and Eli laugh over a drawing. "But tonight, Watching you with those kids, I realized I was wrong." He gestured around the diner, the chipped tiles, the flickering lights, the hum of quiet resilience. "This is success. Not the money, not the number of locations, but the number of people who sleep easier because they know someone truly cares." Carlos nodded. He understood. 6 months ago, success meant not getting fired. Now it meant something else entirely. It was Maya's laughter. It was the life returning to Ellie's eyes. It was the sight of children sleeping in that back booth while their mothers worked themselves to the bone, just knowing they were safe. As choosing humanity over policy, compassion over fear. As Harold stood to leave, he turned back and asked, "Same time tomorrow?" Carlos smiled. Like always. And in that small, unremarkable exchange between a former boss and a former server, lived a quiet promise. That there are things worth more than money, more than safety, more than survival. There is things worth everything. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Moments of Quiet Truth, where we believe that the human spirit is never truly defeated, only waiting to rise.